See, there's a bit of similarities in our themes and interests, but I think it'll probably work out. Global, regional, and local economic development processes are transforming how land, water, and other natural resources are perceived, used, and governed across the Asia region. The changes in many places are fast and quite complex. For many people, there's not much choice but to try and cope, try to adapt. By changing where they live, what resources they use as inputs, and what livelihoods they pursue. Those who are marginalized locally, politically, or socially typically have the least access to resources and are often among the most vulnerable to environmental changes. For those people, the quality of governance is really important to their futures. So in this presentation, I'd like to reflect on a few critical studies of development policies and projects, drawing mostly on examples from managing water, and distill 3 dimensions of governance that I believe are underemphasized but crucial for sustainable development in a changing climate. That is being more inclusive, deliberative, and adaptive. So in some ways I'm unpacking some of the things that Darren put all together underneath the adaptive umbrella. Conventional governance can be characterized as centralized, expert-driven, compartmentalized, and risk-averse. It assumes and forecasts stability and order. That's what it's looking for. Ecosystems are seen as separate from society. Legitimacy comes from elections or performance in delivering and providing services. Failures to achieve objectives are attributed to lack of resources or lack of institutional development. Governance of this type is exclusive, it's prescriptive, and it's persuasive. Alternative governance, on the other hand, is multi-centered, it's learning-oriented, it's integrative, and it's change-ready. If you think about things Darren said this morning, it's about being prepared for also those changes that you can't anticipate, those unanticipated things. Social and ecological systems, land uses and water, livelihoods and landscapes, are seen as intricately connected to each other. Legitimacy also comes from reasoned debate and responsiveness to public concerns. Failures to achieve objectives are seen as opportunities to learn. Governance of this sort is inclusive, deliberative, and adaptive. Adaptiveness in governance is crucial because understanding is incomplete, the impacts of decisions and interventions are uncertain and should be learned from. We need to be willing to adjust policies and practices when they turn out to have been wrong. I think this was one of the key messages of Darren, is this monitoring and evaluation and learning from what you've tried. But at the same time, the past is not always going to be a good guide to the future. We also need to be forward-looking. We need to be monitoring for early warning signs and making assessments using scenario exercises to probe looming issues so that we can be proactive and not just reactive. Think about water managers. They face many challenges under a changing climate and flow regimes that are also affected by many other factors, not just climate itself. Flood return intervals, seasonal and interseasonal patterns of rainfall, runoff and storage estimates. These sort of things are used by engineers to design infrastructure, to figure out operating rules for dams, and of course to negotiate flow allocations between countries, among users, among countries. But is the baseline we're using appropriate? Does it take into account climate change? Does it take into account the fact that there's 5 dams upstream? Does it take into account the interbasin transfers we're planning? Does it take into account the complex responses of farmers as they start irrigating more land? They change land uses, so evaporation changes in that basin. If not, can the rules that we use be easily updated or not? Change, complexity, uncertainty, these raise important institutional issues. What structures, procedures, norms, rules foster this thing called adaptive governance? What helps you get that kind of quality and feature? In my view, there's no panaceas. We don't have any, really supreme list of things that work on all places and all times. But there are a few hints, and I'll just take out a few hints here. First of all, networks are really important to social learning. They can be sometimes called informal networks, shadow networks, policy networks. They help systems prepare for change without being stuck in the bureaucratic norms and relationships that you normally work in your day-to-day life. They're not stuck in those hierarchies. Exploring and combining diverse sources of knowledge expands options, can improve the fit of solutions to problems, and also helps you cross-check claims. Now, if you have people with different disciplinary backgrounds, agency backgrounds, saying, yeah, that fits with my practical experience, or no, it doesn't. You can think of flood managers, local residents. I mean, their experiences, that local knowledge, the practical knowledge, has to be combined often with what your latest scientific assessments say is important from your scenario analysis. Multi-level and polycentric distributions of responsibilities, of capabilities, and power often increase the response capacities to a range of challenges as long as you can deal with the coordination issues. There's obviously some tensions in some of these things. Adaptive governance emphasizes learning. It emphasizes trying to manage for resilience and also in building adaptive capacities. These things are clearly important for adaptation to climate change. It also takes measures to handle uncertainties. The uncertainties for climate variables, for example, if we're trying to figure out is it going to be more or less rainfall 30 years from now, as you project and forecast further out to the future, we actually are less certain what it's going to be like because so much depends on how many emissions we put in. I mean, do we stabilize CO2 or not? Or do we keep going up, not past 450, we go to 700 or 750? The chances of climate surprises, increase extraordinarily. So as we move further out to the future, we can be very, very uncertain about what's going to happen to things. We know we're going to get hotter, but we may not know much about rainfall. There's so many complex interactions. And then we think about the interactions with complex infrastructure, patterns of land use, patterns of water use, patterns of energy use, which may drive water use. What impacts they have on the ecosystems people who grow food depend on, the people who fish depend on. When you combine those things, it's actually, of course, very, very difficult to forecast with any kind of precision. The effectiveness of interventions, those adaptations we do, that we raise the dike, we build dams to store water, we make interbasin transfers to increase dry season water supplies. When all those things interact, it's actually quite hard to predict what's going to happen. This suggests to me and many others that successful adaptation might need some new kinds of strategies. So this is maybe a nice follow-on from the previous speaker. Start thinking about adaptive strategies, not only in S&T policy areas, but more generally. And on this slide, I've just listed a couple. I'm not going to read them out, but these are the sort of things that people start to think about more. No regret strategies. Those common things that Darren said, our colleague from Thailand said, about when all the different scenario analysis say do the same thing, well, you just do those. No? So some of those no-regret strategies like improving water use efficiency, building human resources, those are things that are good to do even if there's no climate change. But of course, other things to think about are whether your strategies are, whether the things you're doing are actually reversible. Can you backtrack? Can you change mid-course when you learn that actually that was wrong? No? And you contrast some of these strategies to mega projects, linking every single river in India, etc. Of course, they have some adaptive elements too, but they also commit you and restrict your options to the future and to an incredible extent. Not even thinking about the social and environmental impacts. Adaptive governance, I put to you, will often make use of these adaptive strategies. The benefits of adaptive governance and policy making, as we heard in particular from Darren, are increasingly acknowledged. But is being adaptive enough? You start asking questions, who has to adapt? Who decides? Who's going to pay for adaptation? Who is left left at risk? I put deliberation, the deliberative element, I think, is another important part. Deliberation takes many forms, but the idea is really of structured and informed conversations. Deliberation is important because stakeholders have different understanding of issues. They draw on different sources of knowledge. We talked about the practical experience of the flood manager, the local resident who lives in a flood-prone area, the climate change scientist. They draw on different bits of knowledge. And people need to be able to question claims. You say that the water's dry in the Mekong because of Chinese dams. Show me your evidence. Show me your data. The whole point of this is that arguments in deliberate politics are actually good things, not bad things. But they need to be informed. they need to be reasoned, and they have to be multiple ways. So